Welcome to Talking Impact, your go-to podcast for exploring the powerful connection between mental health, education, and resilient youth. Join us as we uncover insights and stories that inspire classrooms, stronger minds, brighter futures, and a lasting impact in our society. All right, welcome to another episode of Talking Impact. Today's guest is a good friend of mine, Jonathan Kaiswatum. Jonathan is a Master of Education from both the Cree and Blackfoot Nations, leader from Piapot First Nation in Saskatchewan. Jonathan has held several key roles over his career in education in Alberta and Saskatchewan, including as a teacher, principal, and currently is the Director of Education for Tsuut'ina Nation, right outside of Calgary here. Welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Tansei, Jonathan Kaiswatum, Sigatsun, Piapot Cree Nation, Treaty 4 Territory, Ochinia, Oki, Nistoanakooks, Jonathan Kaiswatum, Kainai Nation here in Treaty 7 Territory. So have family, in Cree and Piapot and Blackfoot here in Kainai. So yeah, happy to be here today.
Fantastic. That sounded like a lot, and for people who are listening who may not have heard an introduction like that before, maybe break it down and explain what you just communicated as far as your people, the land you're from, and your roots.
Yeah, so basically, on my mom's side, we come from the Piapot Cree Nation, which is in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Treaty 4 Territory. That's where my grandparents lived for all of their lives, and they raised my mom and her 10 siblings. So I come from a very large family, Kaiswatum side, and then of course on my dad's side, Many Fingers from Kainai, which is near Lethbridge. So reconnecting with family on the Many Fingers side, being out here in Calgary and in Treaty 7, and just connecting the who's who, and it's been a really beautiful journey for me, learning both cultures and languages and stories, from both sides. Traditionally, the Cree and Blackfoot, are enemies, and they refer to one another as, the Blackfoot would say, oh, those people on the other side of the Red Deer River, and the Cree would say the same thing about the Blackfoot, right? The people on the other side of the river, but, they came to an understanding in Wetaskiwin, which is place of peace, right? So, and just to end all of that fighting. And so I'm very, honored and proud of, who I am, on both sides, on my mom's side and my dad's side.
Yeah. Representing two nations that have such a deep and rich history, not just here in Alberta, but in across Canada and into the United States is something that I've always admired about you is the breadth of not just your understanding, your knowledge, and your wisdom, but also your own experience. Curious, where did it all begin? You, as an educator who's not just had great experience with these nations that you've come from, but also been able to impart wisdom and teaching as a teacher and principal. What was life like for you growing up?
Well, I come from a family of educators. My grandparents, they taught in the community. They weren't officially certified teachers, but they were leaders in their community. Of course, on my dad's side, the late Helen Many Fingers, was a very, distinguished educator in Kainai, down in Blood Tribe. But also too, my parents, they're educators as well. My mom got her first teaching job in Cowessess First Nation, which is in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Treaty 4 Territory. And she taught out there for 16 years. 12 of those years, I was in school down there. So I went to school, in the First Nations community from grade 1 to 12. So that really shaped, who I am and my worldview, and who I am, as a person, as an educator, as a husband, as a son, as a father. Yeah. So it's who I am, right? Yeah.
When you were young, were there any, we talk a lot in Heroes programs about identifying our strengths and living from those strengths. And, were there opportunities early on where you had people within your family or within your community that really helped to bring out the best in you and acknowledge what it is that you had inside?
So really it was my teachers, like I was very fortunate to have all good teachers, growing up, and really looked up to them, for how they guided me and, how they were patient with me. And that was, that was a really different time, in history. Like when you look at Kawasis First Nation, like it was a residential school up until 1996. So essentially I attended residential school, there. I didn't, live in residence. I got to go home, every night to my family, but essentially attended school with people that were, in residential school. And that was a really, like I said, it's a part of who I am. But I always had good teachers, and like I said, they guided me, they believed in me, they told me, they kept me in line. Of course my mom worked at the school, so they could just go to her class
That
and
helps.
tell her like, hey, Jonathan needs to pick it up here, or he's doing really well there. And I always look at some of my favorite teachers, and how they just believed in me. They saw the potential in me, and allowed me to tap into that. Yeah.
What challenges, if you could go back to junior high Jonathan and think about what that young man maybe had in terms of his circumstances or fears or labels that were challenges that you had to overcome?
So some of the challenges were really just, not like, I guess, limited opportunities, in isolated First Nations communities. You're really, like the opportunities, for some students, as opposed to, like people that grow up in larger urban centers, like they're fairly less, in rural communities, and even more so in First Nations communities, right? So opportunities for sports, just club sports and different clubs and music, but also too, like you grow up on the land. So like you grow up, like just being familiar and connected to the land. So there's a trade-off there, right? You're more rural, but you're connected to the land at the same time. So we grew up, playing outside, really, picking medicine, and just hunting, learning how to hunt at a young age, learning how to, like harvest medicine, was something that, was kind of just second nature growing up on the reserve.
Tell me more about this connection to the land. We're learning a lot now as we've developed this program about land-based teachings and ways of being. And how were those experiences and having that as a focus and a value? How did that help you develop at a young age? And what were those things that really stuck with you?
Well, again, of course, you grow up playing outside, right, on your reserve and in your community, and I remember, my grandfather, teaching me how to snare rabbits. My uncles teaching me, how to make a fire, and just bushcraft, and my dad teaching me how to shoot a 22 and shoot a pellet gun. So like just being able to like survive. If anything were to ever happen, we'd have deer and moose and different, just living off the land, right? It wasn't really like, at the time it wasn't called land-based learning. It was more or less just like kind of like a part of who we are, right? And
are there any stories that come to mind, or heroes of yours, or that were talked about within your community growing up that you resonated with and looked up to?
Yeah, I can definitely think of a few that come to mind. Like where I grew up, athletics was a big thing. Track and field, volleyball, basketball. Like we played a lot of sports as well, and we just, like, I looked up to the grade 12 and the older high school students. When I was in junior high, and I think of like for example, like my cousin Greg, who's a really good track and field athlete, like super fast runner and a good high jumper, and really just I saw the medals in his room, and in all of his uniforms for sports, and he'd always come home from tournaments and track meets with medals, because he was a super fast runner. And I always looked up to him, as kind of like one of my pillars of support. And he started playing volleyball around the same time that I did, so we kind of learned that sport together, and that was the way we connected, right?
Awesome.
through sports.
Good mentorship.
Yeah,
for those
really good
older kids.
mentorship. Yeah, he's my cousin, but I take him as a brother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard this, and not sure if it's if I'm going to butcher it, but that the most influential people in a junior high student's life, unfortunately, is not mom and dad. It's not usually the teacher either. It's those kids who are a few years older, who embrace them into their group, into their in group.
Yeah.
That can be both a positive and a negative. Were there pressures within your growing up to look up to maybe not so many positive mentors?
Yeah, of course, like there's always, like social issues that exist, in any community, but like I think like in our First Nations communities, some of those social issues, they're more magnified.
Mhm.
So, we go to school with, people and, see it in our communities, like not so good things going on. And I saw that, with some of the, like when I was in junior high, I saw that with some of the high school students, like with smoking or substance abuse, and it's just kind of like at the time it was just accepted. But so when I got into high school, when I got into grade 10, I I went to the junior boys volleyball tryout at our school, and I told I was very upfront with the teacher that was coaching the team. I said, I'm not a junior high student. I said, but I want to help out. I want to give back. I currently play on the senior boys team. But I said, if you need a hand with running drills or like practices, setting up nets, I can mentor these young men. So she took me up on that without even batting an eyelash. So I'd go to the practices and I would help her with it and, go to games with them, like outside of the school. And she was just really grateful for that support. And even those young men, like in grade 7, they would see me in the high school and they would just, come and talk to me and just make it less daunting for them. Because that's what I would have needed as a junior high student, was just some mentorship. And I think that I thought of that experience as I was coming here today. And really it just came to mind here as we're talking, right?
Tell me maybe a little bit more on that,
Yeah.
because like the that's not something most young people do. Now you've made a career of it, and you're continuing to progress as you go for your education PhD in education leadership, and you don't see that young person too often taking that initiative to purposefully engage with those a few years younger than them. What was the call to action? What was the inspiration for you to step in like that?
I can't quite, pin it down to one thing. It was a number of different things, but like I obviously wasn't perfect growing up, like like when growing up in a First Nations community, there are external factors, that affect some of your choices and, some of your friends. But I just thought of that as like a safe space to like, for our junior high kids at the time, for them to be, who they were through sport and able to just, help them, just express themselves in a good way, through athletics. And I just think of it as, like that was, it was also a safe space for me, because like I could just give back, but also do something that I loved, at the same time. And I always think of that teacher that, like I was teaching her. She was not from the community.
Okay.
She was not athletic either, but she was just so grateful. Like she would say good things to my teachers about me. And that really, it just kind of went a long way. And, of course, my parents were proud of that too. So.
It sounds like you've been, you knew you were going to be a teacher from an early age. When did you really know and feel that urge to make a career of it? What was the mindset? What were the strengths that you wanted to apply? And what was the purpose that you were striving for?
Well, you always want to give back, right? And you always want to look at how you can impact communities and give back to them. And, what better way to give back to my own than, like work at the school. And, like I said, I always had it in me to, to help people. That's just, who my parents raised me to be. And that's, what I decided how I can impact, my own community out of university. So I went to university and got my Bachelor of Education. And, when I was done, before I'd even finished, I talked to the principal in my home community, and he had said, like just, apply, throw your name in there, and we'd love to have you on our team. And sure enough, like I got the job teaching in my home community, and was working alongside my mom and some of the teachers that brought me up.
Beautiful.
Right. So yeah, it just kind of like came full circle. And of course, being in my early 20s at that time, I was still had a lot to learn, but I learned a lot by then.
Did you have a personal mission or like a here's why I want to be a teacher and here's what I want to be able to help students with or help them through?
If I think back to that time, why I decided that, it was just to create change, like create more positive change. And like I said, some of the factors, that affect our community are out of our control, right? But if we can influence like one generation, hopefully they take something, like that I've taught them into the next generation. And you just got to like hope and trust that those, effects like work, even though sometimes it feels like they're working against you.
Maybe go a bit more into those external factors. I know that they, just as you said, to undo them and to create that change, it's about passing it forward to the next generation so they can pass it to the next. What were some of these issues, if you will, that faced the community that you were in that you were trying to undo or trying to affect change for?
Well, again, like in a lot of First Nations communities, it's lack of access to like services and even like just lack of housing and those kinds of things, like you have your families living with other families. And obviously, like there's, some of the more negative sides to things you see as like substance abuse and how that trickles down, to the younger kids. And so like as a teacher, I wanted to just, like go back and give back and see like it is possible, to like go out into, Western institutions and make it, and really like it was just about just giving kids hope. That's what I wanted to do, right? In the midst of some of those things that are, like I said, outside of their control and working against them.
You started early, and you've accomplished quite a lot. And I'm interested to see how, especially for any teachers listening, that transition from being the teacher in the classroom and working with the students every day to principal is not always the right thing, but for you, that seemed to be the calling, is to engage with leaders and to be able to, if you will, scale what it is that you were doing in the classroom. Can you tell us about that journey from teacher to principal?
So I got into principalship when I turned 30. Actually, I was 29 turning 30. And it was, one of my good friends, Chief Cadmus Delorme, who he'd just been elected chief in his home community in Cowessess First Nation. And we had a conversation and he told me about an opportunity. And of course I went through, all the hiring and it just, it worked out. And I got, word that August that I'd gotten the job as principal, in Cowessess First Nation. Cowessess Community Educational Center is a school I attended. So I now had the opportunity to lead that school and really create change. And it was like I left there, when I graduated high school and then came back, as principal, and was just put myself in the shoes of those students that were there when I was principal there, and try to impact positive change through programming and opportunities and partnerships, athletics, academics, just a lot of different fun things that we did, and really just started up a youth council within our school and saw the grade 12s and 11s that were there. My sister was actually attending high school at the time, so got the high school kids to take on a lot of initiatives like student representative council and really like push them with that. And also too, like just did check-ins with our staff, to just for well-being and what are they doing to take care of themselves, and built that relationship with staff. It was kind of like a natural progression for me. Like you're not only affecting change within your classroom now as a teacher, you're like impacting change like at a school level and essentially at a community level too, right?
What were some things that happened during that period of time that were good examples of creating that change factor and seeing it happen? I love what you say about having the students take that ownership, that sense of leadership, not just to be the student learning, but to now be doing. Is so important in everything that we do and teach. But maybe some of the experiences that you had there to bring about some of that positive change that you were striving for.
Well, I think of anything, we need to create space for people to make decisions and also make mistakes. So I think creating a stable environment for people, letting them know, like I showed up for work every day, And, I was a dependable person for them. They knew that I wasn't going anywhere. So creating that stability, if I can model that, for people, then it just creates this environment where people are safe to, express who they are, make decisions, make mistakes, and know that, like we have each other's back at the end of the day. That's really like sort of like goes with my philosophy of leadership as I've evolved, as a teacher, principal, and now director. So,
yeah. Are there any students that come to mind as an example of that process that you took, or maybe a teacher that was maybe resistant to the change, but ultimately became an example of it?
No, you know what? Like again, like growing up, I didn't always see, like principals. Like I didn't see them too often. Like they would be, in their office or at meetings and whatever. And so like I tried to be a very involved principal. So I would get involved with the students. I would participate. I coached too. Like I coached while I was teaching. I coached while I was principal. And I just really, like just got involved as much as I could in the community and events. And I did different like cross country meets with them. I ran with the kids, just participated. And I think it was good for them to see that, here's a young active guy that, like is still involved. And it actually helped me, with some of the, like, of course, as a principal, you're dealing with behavior issues, right? So I was dealing with some behavior issues in the middle school, but then some of the senior high students that I was coaching and essentially like leading, they would, come and model good behavior and tell those students to act accordingly. So it was like that, it all worked.
Creating a bit of a culture shift and a culture around that leadership mindset.
And then of course, those middle school kids, if they saw that, okay, our teachers and even our principal, like have a good rapport with those senior students, they're going to listen to those senior students, right? Like you said earlier.
How, coming from when you attended this school, it was a residential school, and then now you're leading it years later, right?
Yeah.
Until 96. What were some of the main changes that you were able to bring about that helped it to really become a community school that was not just teaching the lessons, but was actually helping to affect that change, and at the same time intertwine it with some traditional teachings and mindsets and ways of being?
Of course, like that old saying goes, it takes a community to raise a child. And, you can't just do it at a school level. Like you can't just do it within the confines of those four walls and roof. You have to reach outside to the different departments and the resources that are available on nations. So that's really what I did, was create connections, with the different, like with health department, with recreation, and tried to, like bring programming to the school, have opportunities for kids, and like I said, I did that in the classroom as well, and also did it, as principal too, but also looked at different aspects of like, like language and culture program, connecting with elders and bringing elders into the school to read with the kids, just to be there for them as a mentor, as a guide.
That is, it's so important, and we're working on this amazing project together for a social studies program here in Alberta, reconciliation through education. The engagement with the elders, I think, is not just vital, but we talk about cultural resurgency and resurgence of language and traditions. Maybe speak to how education was done before we came in, settlers with our boxes and our check boxes and our linear thinking models. How would what are those things that you were able to take from the traditional piece, not just having the elders, but what were some of the things that the elders were a part of, or how they were adding that value to the education experience for the youth?
So I want to reflect back on my second principalship now a little bit.
Yeah, please.
I moved to Alberta in 2019, from Saskatchewan, and I moved to a community in Treaty 6 territory, Tsuut'ina Nation, and I had the opportunity to, be principal there all throughout COVID, though, like 2019 to 2022. And it was really, that was my first time, working outside of my home community. And I had to really just get to know the community and get to know the staff, get to know, like who's who and the different governance structure, organizational structure that was there. So I remember like connecting, like, how do I connect with elders outside of my own home communities? And I was pointed in the direction of an elder, but he doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't email, so you actually have to go see him. So I did. I got, one of the longtime serving teachers at that school to take me, to go see the elder that had been recommended that I go pay a visit. And I sat with him for 5 hours in his home, and we had tea just like this. And of course, I brought him protocol and just said, I want to start the school year off in a good way. And he was telling me like just the history of the community, the history of education in the community, and of course, Enoch Cree Nation being so closely to the city of Edmonton, just some of the historical context there with the provincial school boards. And it really, those 5 hours that I sat with him, you can't learn that in any textbook or in any university class. So it was just as rich, for me to listen and talk. And, I would say I did about 90% listening and 10% talking. But it's kind of like who I am, though, is, is just an active listener. And I took a lot of those teachings into the next school year and really connected him with our staff. And that was kind of one example that I think of when you asked me that question.
If you can go into maybe some of those teachings and also how you were able to integrate them into the learning for the young people. I'm really curious on that part of it, especially as we're building programs and working with different nations in Western Canada. That's a value that we have as an organization, but also one we know that is critical to bring about not just reconciliation, but to empower education programs more effectively.
So a lot of times in schools, you'll have staff members and teachers who are, non-Indigenous, not from the community. And what I felt, would be really important is if we had a cultural sort of camp at Kiteak, Bob Cardinal's house. And so what we did, with that staff at the time was I, helped set up a 2-day, sort of learning camp at his place, at his lodge. And we took all the teachers there and all the staff, and we, did different workshops. We started off with a pipe ceremony and listened to stories, and he was sharing, how to offer protocol, when you ask for things, and what some of the different teachings in the community are. And I thought that was really eye-opening for a lot of our teachers, because teachers, they, once they start the school year, it's curriculum, right? But it's looking at the students that you serve and the community and seeing the community that they come from, right? And realizing that a lot of those teachings within the communities, are more important, than the curriculum documents, right? But also too realizing, curriculum and worldview, Indigenous learners, they need to learn both. We got to learn to walk in two worlds.
No, that's something that we're actively pursuing, is that understanding of nation to nation building, but even more internally is to bring about that understanding, that awareness, that worldview of this nation, the Cree Nation or the Blackfoot Nation, so that those traditions and those teachings can be not just revitalized, but it's a tool that brings out the best in the young people. Could you share maybe some of the examples, if you will, around how those traditional teachings help young people to engage in their learning experience and maybe take their future more seriously and find their passion?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll reflect on, my experience now in my current role, as Director of Education for Tsuut'ina Nation. We have a lot of partnerships, and we work with, provincial school boards, for different agreements. And we're often, looked at, for knowledge. Those provincial school boards, they want to partner with us because, the students on Tsuut'ina attend, schools within those districts. And again, those schools, even though they're situated so closely to the nation, it's a world away, on the other side. Once you cross into the city, you're in a Western institution, in a non-Indigenous institution, and things, are very different, from where our kids come from. So one thing that I shared, with a group of, teachers within Calgary School Board here was it's really important, to get to know your students and get to know their name, the meaning of their name. and where they come from. We often overlook, those aspects. Like I said, teachers and institutions, they want to get to, what the curriculum and their outcomes and objectives, but it's important to like slow down and really just find out, like more of like where that student comes from, and not assume, that all Indigenous students, are the same, because Indigenous, means a lot. Like there's a lot of different languages within this province, within this country, right? Like there's Blackfoot, there's Tsuut'ina, there's Stoney, there's Cree. So many, like we're such a unique people.
Many nations.
Many nations, yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the Cree and the Blackfoot. When did that occur? And it's interesting to know about Wetaskiwin and the meaning of the name, but maybe you'd share a little bit more about that story. And I think it's extremely relevant to the story of Alberta, to be honest. The Red Deer River is a divide, not just geographically, but you have Edmonton in the north, Calgary in the south. And it's an interesting piece of history that I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, so essentially like those, like, those two groups, like the Cree and the Blackfoot, and there's obviously, like a lot of history books and a lot of stories from elders that could tell you, a lot more than what I can share. But like what's been shared with me, is that like there was a lot of like battle over territory, and where our language groups and tribes were situated. So like, you have the Blackfoot nations, that are in southern Alberta and into the United States. And then you have the Cree nations that are, like sort of like central northern Alberta, central southern Saskatchewan. And then, they were kind of eventually, as our people traditionally moved around, right? So eventually like they would run into people that didn't speak the same language. And that was kind of like, that was where it all started. And realizing too that, we need to become allies, against the colonizers and the people like the fur traders, that were coming. And I think that place of peace, and having those peace treaties, like realizing that there's a greater fight on our hands here, and that's with the government of Canada, right, and the railways that were coming, onto our lands, that we know, and of course, again, with treaty agreements, right? Like, so I think, we came to an understanding that we have to get along. We can't continue fighting with one another. That's what's been shared with me.
Yeah. It's beautiful and so important. We hear about this in Calgary, about the where the two rivers here meet, the Bow and the Elbow, and how historically it was a place of meeting and trading and sharing. And there's so many other pieces to our history here, which is a lot of why we're doing a social studies program, not just to expand the ability to do social emotional learning and build resilience in youth, but to really be a part of bringing about cultural resurgence and to learn from the history of the peoples and the nations that called this place home long before the settlers came, and to find a better way to move forward. We are many nations here sharing one land, and I think if we can get it here, there's something we can share with the world as well. But coming back to the education journey that you're on, about a year and a half ago we met at a teachers conference, and we started to talk about our social emotional learning programs and the hero's journey and what we're working on next. What was it about this new program, Reconciliation Through Education, that led you to get inspired and join our circle of advisors?
Well, again, like looking at, Indigenous students, living here, in Calgary, attending like non-Indigenous institutions and really not seeing themselves, in any of the buildings or like the staff members or even the curriculum. So what really stood out to me was, some of the foundations of the Education for Reconciliation project and what we want to achieve, at Impact Society, right? And really those like coming to know like how, the curriculum starts with like a historical context and it moves into like, like more current context, and it goes through like, the fur trade and colonization and residential schools. And it takes that sort of like timed approach, that I just mentioned, and how students can connect with that, right? Because like it's reconciliation, it's everyone's responsibility. I'll just put it that way. It's not just us as Indigenous people. It's non-Indigenous people too. Like,
can you share with how would you define reconciliation? What does it look like? What's the evidence of it?
So first, it's coming to an understanding, of like where we come from, and where we would like to go, on this journey together. Because like the history of Canada, like it's not often shared, and I think back to like, the apology in 2008 by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and what that meant, to Indigenous people, the former generations and current generations and future generations. What that means, is it's acknowledging like the past history and like what happened in this country, with this government, and what the goal of that government was, to destroy the Indian and the child, and those are very
that was an explicit goal.
It was an
explicit
explicit
just
goal.
Something that happened as a side effect. That was the intent.
That was the intent, and then really like it's an acknowledgement of, okay, what that did exist, but how do we move forward, because we can't continue to stay stuck, and then because that we know what that result, it's just going to continue to, for us to, fight with the governments, and, we need to work together as as two governments and self-governing nations, but really to like help people understand, that those treaty agreements, they don't exist, with the government of Canada, they exist with the Crown. And then knowing that, those treaty agreements were signed with the Crown, and that's honoring, that really that stewardship versus ownership. So I think of that understanding, through treaty agreements, and even that understanding now with reconciliation. A lot of those principles are the same there. Like it's coming to an understanding, and that's what that means to me.
Yeah. And one thing that has affected me going through the treaties is how far the reality was from even the intent, and even that the intent was settlers are coming and here's your agreement in many ways, shapes, and forms, but that even then the spirit of the agreements was ignored by and large.
And that's kind of like, it's when you start off on that foot, like ignoring those agreements and, kind of like deceiving, like our former leaders that signed those treaties, that like when they put their finger on the paper or when they touched that pen, that was an agreement with the Creator. And seeing, the government not like stand by those agreements, that's what those mean, to a lot of our people. And I think, like if we were to revisit the inherent rights, that we have as Indigenous people, like we would really see like the truth that why those agreements were signed, is to sustain our people. And that, because that's our worldview, right? Is like nobody owns the land. Right. It belongs to everyone. Yeah. Nobody really ever owns it.
There was not really a sense of property ownership prior to settlement, right?
No, it was meant to be shared with everyone. And it is, if you look at it, like it's, you only take what you need from the land. Yeah. And that's, again, that was a teaching that was shared with me, like growing up. Only take what you need. Don't take more, leave some for everybody else, right?
Yeah. Give me maybe an example on that. I know especially Treaty 7, a lot of that deals with the buffalo and their migration patterns, and it was intended to be a way to, again, continue to share the land and preserve the people, but not just the people, but preserve their way of life. You speak to what you just told me about, and only take what you need, and how deep that connection to the land or to the buffalo is within I'd say the governance through story within the nations.
Well, if you look at one buffalo, and what that can do for a community, what that can do for a family, like you can, like all of the meat, is meant to last a very long time, depending on the size of the family. And even like some of the, the bones, every part of the buffalo was used. It had a purpose, and then all of it was meant for, for that's how we lived. We knew that, we only took what we needed.
Mm.
And that, like whenever like that principle, that belief, worldview too, it like really carries me forward. Like it's still like it's in my DNA, and it's who I am, to only take what I need, and then not take more, because this land has to last us forever, right? It has to last future generations. And I think of like, really that ownership principle and some of the extraction of resources, and even like things like water and air, and how we're headed with climate change. It goes to show like how people are taking more than they need. And it's scary.
Yeah. I can't help but think about the parallels there, though, that every part of the buffalo has a purpose. And that's something that we teach through our programs, and we'll be teaching through this program, not just about the buffalo, but about how each of us, our experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, are not just our strengths, but our circumstances, fears, and labels aren't just things to be thrown away. We don't say ignore these walls. Use your strengths to use these walls as opportunities to grow. So if it's a circumstance you're facing, don't hide from it and curse the darkness, if you will, but there's something to be learned and something to be taught here. It really resonates with that concept of everything has a purpose within this animal. Is there a parallel in terms of how that individual view of who I am and who I am within my community, within the parallel there?
Well, really, like when you look at storytelling, and like stories come from, like they were in our societies for a very long time. If you think of like, powwow, for example, and how some of the dances, were shared. Like some of the warriors, they would go and hunt, and they would go and, like sometimes engage in battle with other tribes. And then they would come back to their home fires and their camps, and they would traditionally like show, like they would shoot arrows and tell stories, through dance, to their societies of, like what happened. And that's how, and people would drum, while they told those stories. So that's how, powwow came to be. And I also think of too, like going back to that storytelling aspect, when you look at like everything, like there's a lesson to be learned in everything. And one teaching that was shared with me, and it'll always stay with me, is like we just got to move on. Like we got to forgive. Like we can't hold things in here, like in our hearts, because it only works inward. So we need to learn how to forgive. And I think, like with almost all Indigenous people that I met, were very forgiving, and regardless of what happened. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, because like the more we hold on to something, it creates this conflict. And like I said, in order to sustain like our societies and our languages, we can't continue to battle like with governments, because it's not always a good ending, right?
Yeah.
Like we need to really go by those peace agreements, those treaty agreements.
I love that. In your education leadership, I can't help but think, as you're moving into your PhD now, studying educational leadership, how have some of these experiences for yourself as an individual, as well as through history, helped to shape what it is that you're wanting to study and to research in your new adventure?
Well, of course, in this role that I currently have, with Tsuut'ina, like it's, again, I spoke to teachers impacting in their classrooms, principals impacting in their schools, but, like senior leaders impacting at a district level. So, like the decisions that I make directly impact, like the staff and the students. And so I really make those, with the best interests of the staff and students in mind, and collectively too, right? Like, because like we need good leaders, that have the best interests of the students in mind, and just engaging in different partnerships, creating opportunities for students. And there's a lot of them that exist, like we're finding that a lot of like organizations within the city and provincially, they want to partner with us, because they want to, like help us meet outcomes, like for whatever it may be, like climate change, reconciliation. So I think, as in my current role, like seeing what these opportunities are about and engaging in, the ones that are going to have the most impact on our students, and really going back to the question, thinking of like in the studies that I'm going to be soon undertaking, like looking at how can we do that at a more like, like bigger level, I guess, within academia and within government. I'm always looking to, like just help, help achieve better outcomes for our students.
If you could kind of project that thought forward, what could that look like within, whether it's a policy framework or an education curricular framework?
Well, it's definitely like policy frameworks, because I find that with government agencies, again, we're working with people that I don't see myself in a lot of them, and I know that these government agencies, they're wanting to hire Indigenous people because we understand like what our students and families go through. So I think really developing policies that are reflective of what our students, families, and communities need, that's really where I see some of the change that needs to be made, and it is being made. There's been a lot of change since I was a student in the classroom, but there's always room for more change, right? And I want to be a part of that.
Within, whether it's the individual or the community piece, you mentioned those challenges, and I can't help but think about the challenges that we see in public schools. Low resilience, lack of hope, lack of purpose. They're striving for a sense of identity, especially in these 12 to 17 years of age. That really is the formative years, and our society seems to have a deficit when it comes to providing rites of passage and understanding and a sense of belonging within culture, within community. What are you seeing in your community and some of those challenges? Are they similar? Are they different? Are they more extreme?
Well, going back to the part of your question, like within provincial schools, like, being a father, to school age children, I go to their schools and I see some of the initiatives, that the provincial schools are taking, for reconciliation. For an example, I went to my daughter's volleyball game last fall, and it was around September 30th. And I saw, within their hallways, they had the 94 calls to action within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that was really, really powerful for me to see, and it really made me feel welcome as an Indigenous person within that space. That, I want to say 90% of the enrollment at that school are, non-Indigenous, maybe even higher than that. And for people to learn, at a young age, that what are the 94 calls to action? That was really powerful for me to see.
Is there an awareness and how around the 94 calls? I was going to come back to that before, especially as it's part of not just the reason for the work that we are undertaking here, but also each chapter aligns with different calls to action, and that the students will be learning about those calls to action as they're going through their experiential and historical learnings. How has that resonated, and how does it help support the learning of young people that you're serving now?
Well, I think it really provides a framework, for what we need to accomplish as a society for, Indigenous people to move forward and move forward in a good way. Like all of those calls to action, some of them are for, social justice and education and health and recreation. Like there's so much valuable information in them, and if we were to, just unpack even one of them, there's so many different ways that we could, work towards reconciliation, all Canadians.
Speak to the importance of education in that.
Well, I mean, people go to school, right? And education, we spend a lot of our time in school. We spend, our formative years right up until we're 18 in school. And I think, it's the most, it's generational shifts. When I look at, my generation, as a millennial, what I was taught in school, versus what my children are being taught. And that's, that there are calls to action, and that there is reconciliation happening, within, non-Indigenous communities, including here in Calgary. So it makes me excited, for what, my grandchildren are going to be learning when they're in school, if this trend continues, because, Indigenous knowledge is very, it's very sacred. it's very powerful, and I just think it's going to be more sought after, as we move along, as we move forward.
One thing we were very aware of in our programs, and just the knowledge about how young people, everybody learns. To just hear a thing and memorize it isn't really the full learning journey. And things we read, we only retain 5 to 10% of. Whereas when we take part, we learn by doing, or when we teach others, we learn 80 to 90%. And we retain that information. If there's a thought from a teacher's perspective, how can a teacher help to make those words from any one of those calls to action be part of an experience to actually resonate with the young people, whether it's an Indigenous or non-Indigenous classroom or student? How do we take the power of the words and translate it into the stories that the young people are building about themselves?
Well, I think, getting if you have an Indigenous student in your classroom, getting to know, like I said earlier, who they are, where they come from, where their community is, what their last name means. Sometimes those students may not always know, so maybe help guide them, to see, where they come from and what it means to be Indigenous, right? And a lot of that is, again, through storytelling and, listening to their stories. And I think, when you have different cultures, there's different cultural practices, but as Indigenous people, one thing that's common throughout is listening, and then speaking in turn, and really just giving people space to share. I think, as educators, that'll really go a long way, in serving Indigenous students and letting them know that, okay, well, tell me a little bit about that, and not being so, stuck to an agenda or a schedule, because I know for me, when I attend meetings and any presentations or conferences, right away, as soon as the presenter or the chairperson or whoever it may be, when they start off with a story or when they tell a story, it just puts me at ease. So that's one piece of advice that I would share.
Bring in the story. That's why every chapter of every program that we have and will make starts with that personal story. The process of story making, and one of the books that we've been going through as part of our research as a team talks about the differences in the governance structure and legal structures of Indigenous peoples and nations here in Canada, especially when the settlers came. They came with their books and their words, some stories, but often it was a to-do list and a to-don't list. And what I find beautiful and fascinating and so nurturing is that a lot of the laws, if you will, or the rules or the governance was not this written code, but it was through the stories. Maybe speak to how that was so essential to preserving the nations and also important to the resurgence that we're seeing.
Well, even in the work that I do, currently, but, some of the, ceremonies that I attend, a lot of it is just listening to elders and listening intently, not listening to respond, but listening to, what are they trying to share, and honing in, because that's a communication skill, is listening. And like I said, there's something to be learned, with every story. And I really feel that, if I can't say it enough, it's taken me so far in my journey, is just by listening to people and learning different words and what they mean and hearing language. It's been really powerful for me in my journey.
Do you have a favorite story?
Oh gosh, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but
that's all right. We're putting it together right now, and what I love about this program is taking the 7 sacred teachings and using those as part of the theme, not just part of the theme, but an essential aspect of each module to go through from pre-settlement to today, to help young people form their own concept and their own commitment to reconciliation. But with every chapter, there's going to be a story of somebody who is an exemplar within the community at that time in history, to really personalize that, just as we do in many of our programs, that hero that has gone through it, that had to face the challenge, whether it was pre-settlement or during residential schools in different periods of time, that was that example that not just preserved, but moved the culture forward. The other thing that we're attaching to it too is the traditional story that actually sets the stage before they get into today. That helps set that scene. We were talking about the turtle as one of the sacred teachings, especially in tying that one to the settlement period when residential schools came in. And some of our toughest chapters that we've had to actually create a few more weeks to create more room to be open to facing the uncomfortableness of the truth aspect, because if we don't face that, it's truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
That turtle, though, the whole concept of it is that it has that ability to be able to go internal. It can't be a rabbit and run fast. It can't be a goat and climb high, but it has its ability to be who it is. And so often we see this with so many youth, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. It's that, who am I? Oh, I'm trying to be a rabbit, but really I'm a turtle. Mm-hmm. And with that sense of self, that sense of identity, we were talking about this in our last meeting, was the not just the ability to go within and go back to your true self and to have that protection, but also sometimes you do have to move and you have to keep going forward, but you know that you have that protection and that sense of self and that identity that can preserve you as you move through maybe a fire, maybe a storm.
Well, I think, like animals can adapt. They can adapt to changing conditions and different, landscapes and weather and all of that. And I think humans can as well, and it's really looking at, each animal, like animals are our ancestors, in a lot of Indigenous stories, you'll hear them, they're about animals, the purpose that they serve and how they got, different features, like, I don't know, I can't think of any again, like off the top of my head. I was told so many as a child, but each animal serves a purpose, and every animal, is useful, to something and to the environment. And I think of that, like that teaching, like that's really important, for youth to hear, like because being a youth is tough. You're trying to figure out like who you are and, the kid that you were and where you want to be and where you want to go and all these life questions. But I think, if they can carry with them that, that they matter and that they have a purpose and that they will find that purpose, I think, as educators and mentors and, it's our job to help them get there and honor where they're at, right? And really just help them figure out who they are and guide them, guide them in a good way.
Yeah. How do you go about that? You work with so many teachers and principals now in Tsuut'ina Nation. How do you help those teachers who might be feeling burnt out or that they're not affecting these kids like they want to? And how do you help provide them with that safe environment, but also that encouragement to really invest and engage with the young people they serve?
Well, as educators, in schools, like we often say like, oh, it's about the kids. And, when we look at our purpose and our why, it's about serving youth, but also too, I think equally, like we need to ask ourselves, like especially as leaders within a building or within an organization, like we need to take care of the adults too. Like we need to help the adults, like the staff members, take care of one another and take care of themselves because they're carrying that work forward, right? I think, like the more we have healthy adults, we'll have healthy children and healthy communities, right? And it's a trickle down effect. I think it's looking after, like people's mental health and really knowing, like the things to say to them, like when they need to take a day off or, like being flexible with people, because like trusting people goes a long way. Like, and that's, I can't say that enough, right? Like if you see the best in people, you'll get the best out of them.
Love it.
And I think, like if we do that with the adults within the organization, they'll do that with the kids, right?
So much of our approach is not just training the trainer, not just providing the materials, but to walk with them as they walk with the students. That the best teachers are the ones who are doing it with, not just the ones who are reciting the lines and know all of the information. And no one cares what you know until they know how much you care. And helping to empower teachers to not feel they need to be the sage on the stage with all of the expertise and all of the information, but really the guide on the side who comes along them and is able to help them to take that one next step is so critical to the work that we do. Last question is about the future. What you see the future for young people, young Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people, when it comes to how they'll be able to carry this this torch into the next generation, to not just undo the past, but to actually reconcile it and move forward.
Well, again, I think back to those teachings, that I learned in school, and the teachings that are there, with my children. And it excites me, for what their children are going to learn as well, like future generations, because it's acknowledging the past, yes, but it's also, creating like these calls to action. And how do we action them, right? Like, and I think, it's a good framework, for us to start. And I think the more we dive into it, the more organizations and governments will see like what their part in that role is. We're seeing it, like I said, as Indigenous people, our knowledge is sought after, like from companies, and that's through whether that be through resilience training or cultural understandings. Like there's always lots to be learned, about the land that we're situated on, right, and who occupied it, and who traditionally these lands, who was on them, and I think that's what better to hear it from than the Indigenous people that were here for time immemorial, right? That's why they call it Turtle Island, North America.
Turtles all the way down, right?
Turtles all the way down, right?
Love that. And as we work together, that's that shared vision really is through reconciling the past, we find a way forward. The world's so full of conflict. And a lot of it comes down to not being able to share the land with your neighbor, or not being able to see eye to eye with those people who are right next door to you.
Yeah.
And I think come back to the Cree and the Blackfoot here, that they demonstrated that long before we even said sorry. And I think that strength and that vision to be many people, many nations, one land, who know who we are and are strong in who we are and are able to collaborate and work together and alongside is really the only way forward.
Well, I think, when we look at September 30th, and what that means now to people, like National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, acknowledging again, it's what happened, but also too, that's very recent. That's within this current generation of students. So if you look at, the conversations, that those students will be having, with their children, and how it'll be even more filled with, what people need to know.
They'll have some wins under their belt, I hope.
Exactly, yeah, to achieve reconciliation.
Really is the spark is this generation, and it's meant to be fostered and carried. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your time. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and to be a co-creator with you on this amazing education journey that we're building, and to know your story and to know your passion and how you've been able to be a leader of leaders within Indigenous education is so inspiring, and we're fortunate to know you. Thank you.